Hello and welcome to the Petticoated Swashbuckler. My name is Maren and we are ready for another decade in another century of the Middle Ages. In my process to cover every 60s, all of the 60s, in the medieval period, we've come to the 1400s, the 1460s. We're now squarely in the late Middle Ages. Almost kind of... I have heard people say that the 15th century is kind of the start of the Renaissance, of the early modern period, and, you know, kind of the end of the medieval period. And there are several reasons for that. A lot of things happened toward the late 1400s that are really very modern, very early modern. Martin Luther with his thesis on that church door in Wittenberg, Christopher Columbus landing on an island in the West Indies, wreaking havoc for hundreds of years to come. A lot of these things really belong to the early medieval the early modern period. A lot of these things really belong to the early modern period. However, 1460s, still medieval, we're still going to do it. Now, by 1460, there are really two wars that have affected the world, or affected Europe, for a while. First of them is the 100 Years' War, which lasted 116 years, but who's counting? And it was a war between England and France. And to put this very, very simply, it was ever since the Norman invasion of Britain, which we talked about in the 1060s dress video. Ever since the Norman conquest, there's been a link between the kings of England and the kings of France. And sometimes this has worked fine, sometimes, very often, more often than not, it has not worked that well. England have tried to kind of claim bits and pieces of France. France has tried to claim England, or at least to demand that the kings of England kind of pay some sort of tax or fealty, you know, that they acknowledge that the French kings are kind of above them, which the English kings don't want to for some weird reason. And when we talked about Eleanor of Aquitaine, that was the 1160s dress video. When she was married to the King of France first, and then married King Henry of England. And she owned a large portion of what is today France. So when she married King Henry of England, she really brought with her a big chunk of France that became English. This is known as the Angevin Empire. This England and other bits of Britain and some bits of France as well. That was kind of one big English empire. It didn't last very long because they had a lot of kids, and these kids fought and didn't leave a lot of heirs, so it didn't last very long. But all of this is a background for why the 100 Years' War broke out. This is simplifying it massively. I did, when I studied history, I did a semester, a topic, a study group thing about chivalry in the Middle Ages, and that idea of chivalry, of what it is to be chivalrous, really is also important in the start of the 100 Years' War, because it's this idea that the noble class became noble because they were the best at fighting. They were the most useful subjects of the king. But when they, when technology moved on and they became less useful, they kind of had to build up this idea of chivalry. You know, we're no longer powerful because we're good at fighting. We're powerful because we are better than you at some kind of higher level. We're more chivalric. And this idea of chivalry became very important in this war as well. How to fight like a knight and not like a peasant. I'm not going to go into the 100 Years' War because it's long and messy, and but it's back and forth. It's not like massive war for 116 years, but there's several small battles and skirmishes and a lot of raiding. The English would come over to France and do what's called the chevauchée, which means basically raiding, burning, and messing up the countryside, forcing whoever's responsible for that bit of countryside to kind of come and do something about it. Very nasty thing. War tends to be nasty, but it was part of the way of waging war. By 1460, the 100 Years' War has come to a close. England has lost a lot of the bits that they own in France. Not quite all. Some will disappear in the century to come. But it's not been a massive success for the British, but also not like the worst crisis ever. So it's okay. Then, as a kind of an effect of the 100 Years' War, there is a war of succession in England, and it's called the Wars of the Roses. Again, not one massive big war, but loads and loads of smaller battles, smaller wars between two fractions who both wanted to be kings of England, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And there are a ton of videos about the Wars of the Roses, so I won't go into that, in detail, but it was big, it was bloody, it was messy, and it affected England and especially the royal house of England massively. If you remember when I did my Anne Boleyn costume last spring, that house that she married into, the House of Tudor, came to power as a result of the Wars of the Roses. So, important. Now, the 1460s, 1400s really, were a messy period, not only in Western Europe, but also in the East. Constantinople was taken over by the Muslims, changed name to Istanbul after a while. And this meant that a lot of Greek scientists who had been hanging out in Constantinople and, the Roman Empire, when it was divided into East and West, the eastern half kept going for so much longer. They just, survived for a lot longer than the western part. So it's really in the 1400s, when Constantinople fell to the Muslims, that that bit of the Roman Empire fell. And because of that continuity, Greek scientists in Constantinople had been able to draw on a lot of old Greek and old Roman literature and science. Now, being displaced from Constantinople, from Istanbul, they moved westward. And this really was part of why the Renaissance happened. This rebirth of classic ideas, ancient ideas, because those Greek scientists came in contact with West European scientists. Alongside with all this war and conquest and messiness, there were good things happening as well. Trade was expanding. Italians were experimenting with banking, which was, a very good idea. It meant that you didn't have to carry all your cash with you. You could deposit your cash at one branch of a bank, and then they would give you a note saying, we owe you this much money, and then you take that note to another branch of that bank in another town in another country and say, I want my money back, and they'd be like, yeah, sure, here you go, and they'd give you cash back. And it's really the start of our modern banking system, which I don't know how I would deal without it, to be honest. And in the 1440s, Johannes Gutenberg began working with the printing press and movable type, which meant that the time it took to produce books fell from years to like days. And the price fell as well. And of course, that meant that literature became more available. So we do see in the 1400s a lot of things that are kind of leading forward towards the Renaissance. All those Greek scientists and the banks and the trading and the printing press. But then again, there are a lot of things that are very medieval still in the 1400s. In 1461, the bloodiest, nastiest battle of the Wars of the Roses took place in Towton. So it's safe to say that the 1460s, England had other things on their mind than, you know, fashion. And of course, there were a lot of fashion happening in Italy, but Constantinople was now no longer part of that European fashion sphere. So, you know, trade with the East became a little more difficult. So the big kind of fashion capital of Europe, of Western Europe at least, in the 1460s was Burgundy. Now, the Duchy of Burgundy is a big chunk of central and northern France in the 1460s, along with bits of Belgium and the Netherlands, and it's just expanding. It's very big. It was so big and so powerful. It was a threat to the French king. And they did not have a civil war like the UK. And with the end of the Wars of the Roses, the Dukes of Burgundy, especially one guy known as Philip the Good, who ruled until 1469, they really managed to establish Burgundy as this powerhouse of a lot of things, but including fashion. They owned the cities of Bruges and Antwerp, which were big, important trading centres for the textile trade. So where you would have wool from England, for example, being exported to Bruges and to Antwerp, and then being woven in Belgium and in the Netherlands, and then exported out again back to England or to France or to Italy and Spain. So this made the duchy really kind of a fashionista city. My inspiration for my outfits for the 1460s is Burgundy, because I want to be, you know, height of fashion. And I found this painting by Petrus Christus. It's from the 1460s. It's called Niende Stifterin, which I think means something like kneeling found dress or something. She's wearing a white shift. You can just see it kind of around her neckline. She's wearing a black kirtle. And then she's got a red gown, and these were often called Houppelande, and it's got some grey lining or grey trim. She's wearing a belt, and she's wearing probably the most iconic medieval headdress of all time, the Hennin. Have you seen Hennins? Have you seen, you know, if you imagine medieval princesses, they have these big pointy hats with like a veil on top. Think of Barbie, like medieval Barbie. That's what I'm talking about. That's a Hennin. They were really popular. The lady in the picture, she's wearing what would be called a truncated Hennin. So it's or maybe kind of, I've seen it referred to as a flower pot Hennin. With instead of that big pointy cone, you kind of chop it off before you get to the big point. So you can get through doorways and stuff like that, but it's still really pretty, and you can like trim it. It's on your head, everyone will see it, so that's where you put all your bling. Now, the woman in the painting, she's probably wearing a velvet gown, and it could be wool. I mean, wool and velvets were produced in the 1400s. They were very expensive and very fancy. She also has probably grey fur, I think, in her gown, in her Houppelande. And she's also got this weird metal scaffolding around her Hennin, which is amazing, but not something I can replicate with the time frame that I have. So I'm going to make the budget version. And I think this is something that would have been done, where people would look to Burgundy, they would look to like the height of fashion, and they would say, we want that, but we can't afford exactly that. It's a bit like knockoff designer wear. Or, you know, big design houses will come up with something, and then half a year later you'll find something that is very clearly inspired by it in like H&M or Zara or something like that. So I'm going to make a budget version of the Burgundian luxury outfit. And unlike the 1260s and the 1360s, where I had like everything, I made a gown, that was it. I made a green gown for the 1260s video. Apart from that, I had everything sorted. Unlike that, for the 1460s, I don't really have anything. It's not a period I've done before. For my white shift, I will use the white shift that I made for my Anne Boleyn costume. And I'm just going to use my red wool hosen that I have made for the 1200s and 1300s outfits, because they don't really change that much in shape or style throughout the medieval period. But apart from that, I'm going to have to make everything else, starting with my kirtle. So I'm going to make mine black wool, and I'm going to make it front laced like the blue kirtle from the 1360s. However, by the 1460s, there is one big difference. A lot of images of people in their kirtles show them with a waist seam. The silhouette is still very narrow. It's nowhere near like the kirtle I made for Anne Boleyn, where you have a ton of fabric pleated into a bodice. The skirts are still quite narrow around the waist, but it's a difference. Instead of having those long panels and then trying to shape them to the body, you now cut them so that you shape the bodice and then you attach the skirts on. So it's more efficient on fabric, I guess. I'm also going to do short sleeves, because a lot of kirtles from the 1460s have really short sleeves, like t-shirt sleeves. And then you would have separate long sleeves that you would pin on top. So the first thing I did was I cut my bodice, just using a plain bodice pattern that I have. I pinned it and I just put it on and adjusted it to fit me. I then cut a lining to fit and stitched together the lining and the bodice and attached those. I stitch that triangle gore in place. This is really the rest of that underarm gore, that square underarm gore that I showed you for the 1260s. By this point, it's become just a triangle at the back of the sleeve, and later on it will disappear completely and you'll have shaped sleeves. And also, look at that cute wax block I got from my friend Twooden. It's shaped like a Lego brick. I love it. I stitch that triangle gore in and I lay the seams. I even out the cuff of the sleeve and I insert the sleeves. I then attach the skirts. They are cut flared for less volume at the waist, but there's still more volume at the waist than my waist measurement is, so I just pleat them in a little bit. And then finally I make some eyelets for lacing in the front. And that's my kirtle done. Now, I could not go without the iconic headwear for the period. I went for the truncated version to look a little more like the woman in the painting, and also in an effort to not topple over and become unbalanced. But this is where I really splurged. This is where I put all my nice shiny fabrics and trims. I started by making a buckram cone and stitching that up. Then, to help it keep its shape, I added some wires around the head opening and also up the middle of the cone. A lot of images of these Hennins show a little black loop in the front, and I saw someone who had a theory that this was actually the velvet-covered loop of metal wire that's sewn into the buckram and which helps keep it on your head, so I added that. I then covered the whole thing with felt, and I trimmed my silk that I wanted to use. I then covered everything with the silk and I lined it all with linen. Now for the gown, or the Houppelande, I decided to do some redesign. Do you remember the red blio I made for Rowena, my Rowena cosplay a couple of years ago? The shape of a blio and the shape of a Hennin, especially when the blio is not shaped like my white one, is very similar. So I decided to do some redesign. I recut the sleeves and the arm size, and I added some grey wool, cuffs and collar, and some at the hem. I also made a cap, a tailed cap. I made an apron because no decent woman, at least no decent English woman, would ever be seen without her apron. And then I made a little surprise. And then I took it all to my nearest ruin. My first outfit is really that of a working woman's outfit. Wearing my white linen shift, a black kirtle, apron, tailed cap, and it's really comfy and practical. I am super happy with this kirtle. It is cute and it's really comfy. This lady is a lot more posh. I've got the red gown on top of the kirtle, and I've got a Hennin with a veil on the head. I have to say, I'm not super happy with the Hennin. It's a tad too small. It fits perfectly until I put the silk on, so I'm considering taking the silk off and then like widening the silk panel with some extra fabric in the back, but we'll see. I also use a wide belt instead of a narrow one like in the painting, because a lot of the illustrations of the period show women with really wide belts. But what is this? A woman of ill repute? Okay, so many places had rules for sex workers and what they had to wear to be identified as such. And in the London of the 1460s, women who sold sex had to wear striped hoods and no aprons, because they were for decent women only. So I made a sex worker hood. She's also successful enough to be able to afford some pretty velvet sleeves. And I have to say, with the hood and the sleeves, she was the warmest and most comfortable lady on this rather cold November day. I don't know what that tells us about prostitution in the late Middle Ages, but there you go. What do you think of my sexy medieval woman costume? Maybe something to think of for next Halloween. I hope you enjoyed this. I had fun learning about this new period. Next week we're going to do the last video that I could possibly justify calling the Middle Ages. We're going to do the 1560s, which is, it's very debatable whether that's the Middle Ages, but I'm a completionist, so we'll do it. Anyway, I hope you have a good time. I'll see you next time. Bye!